I drove 6 hours to honor my father, only to be told I was trespassing on memories I helped build. A glossy white SUV blocked the mountain road. A blonde in a blazer stood next to it, staring like she'd spotted a stray dog at a wine tasting. "You're not authorized to use this road," she said, as if grief needed a gate code. "Drop a comment if an HOA ever made you feel like an outsider on your own land." I kept quiet, but my hands shook. My dad used to say this cabin was freedom. Now it was fenced off by signatures and steel. But the thing about legacies, some are written in ink, others in legal loopholes they forgot to erase. The sight of that gate hit me like a physical blow. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, feeling Dad's urn grow heavy in my lap. This road had been our sanctuary, where he'd taught me everything about environmental investigation. I remembered being 12, walking this path while Dad pointed out drainage systems. "Son," he'd said, kneeling beside a culvert, "when you're looking for environmental crimes, always follow the water. Pipes don't lie. They lead straight to the truth." His weathered hands had shown me how to identify different pipe types, spot unauthorized connections, read the landscape for contamination signs. Those lessons felt like a lifetime ago, but now they were about to become crucial again. The woman introduced herself as Karen Whitfield, Pine Ridge HOA president, like announcing royalty. She stood in her pressed blazer and designer heels, completely out of place against the Oregon wilderness. Behind her, the forest stretched, deep and dark, old-growth pines, creating a natural fortress around the hidden community. The isolation was intentional. Pine Ridge was built far from prying eyes, accessible only by this single road through miles of protected forest. "This decision was made by the Board for Safety and Property Values," she continued, smugly satisfied. I could see she'd been waiting for this moment, probably rehearsed this speech in her bathroom mirror. The gate was impressive and ominous. 10 feet tall, industrial steel with electronic locks and security cameras on reinforced posts. This wasn't temporary. They'd invested serious money to keep people out, specifically to keep me out. The electronic hum mocked me as I sat there, remembering Dad's final months, when he'd grown paranoid, talking about watchers in the woods and people who don't want the truth to surface. I'd dismissed it as sick man's rambling, but now I wondered if he'd known this confrontation was coming. The cameras tracked my movement as I got out, their red lights blinking like predatory eyes. As I looked around the cabin area, something caught my eye: fresh tire tracks and disturbed earth near the property line. Heavy machinery tracks, the kind used for underground construction. Someone had been digging recently, and it wasn't landscaping. The earth was turned in neat rows, carefully covered with topsoil and scattered leaves. Professional work, but not quite professional enough to fool someone trained to spot environmental crime. I could see subtle soil color differences. New plantings hiding excavation marks, compression patterns indicating heavy equipment access. That's when I noticed it. Black plastic pipe barely visible beneath leaves near the old oak tree. This wasn't standard drainage. The pipe was thick, industrial grade, running from deeper in Pine Ridge toward the river below. Dad's voice echoed in my memory. "Son, when investigating environmental crimes, always follow the pipes. They lead to the truth." I knelt and brushed away debris, revealing 3 feet of exposed piping, disappearing into the forest floor. The plastic was UV resistant, designed for long-term underground use, with installation looking recent despite partial concealment. The smell hit me as I leaned closer. Faint but unmistakable chemical odor that made my trained nose twitch. This wasn't carrying rainwater or residential waste. The scent was sharp, industrial, with chlorine overtones and something else unidentifiable. I photographed the pipe, surrounding area and soil patterns. My EPA training kicked in: document everything, preserve evidence, assume nothing is coincidental. Whatever flowed through this hidden pipeline didn't belong in residential areas, and definitely not near Cascade River, which provided drinking water for 3 downstream communities. Karen watched from her Mercedes, tapping impatiently on her phone, probably wondering why I was taking so long to leave. I walked back to my car with new purpose. This wasn't just about accessing Dad's cabin. This was about finishing what he'd started. The pieces were connecting: the mysterious illness that killed him, the sudden career destruction, the expensive gate blocking access to evidence that could expose everything. I took one last look through the steel bars, holding his urn tighter. "Dad," I whispered, "I think I'm about to find out what you were really investigating. What would you do if they blocked your father's final wish? Drop a comment. Because I didn't walk away, I dug." I checked into Pine Creek Motel that night, a rundown place with thin walls and questionable plumbing, but the only accommodation within 20 miles of Pine Ridge. I spread Dad's old files across the bedspread, trying to piece together his investigation from 22 years ago. Most documents were water damaged and incomplete, but I could make out references to unauthorized construction and environmental violation. His handwriting was sharp in the margins, notes about irregular permits and buried connections that made more sense now. Around 2 a.m., someone knocked softly on my door. Through the peephole, I saw Henry Torres, a weathered man in his 70s, who introduced himself as the retired Pine Ridge mailman. His hands shook as he spoke, this meeting clearly taking considerable courage. "I knew your father," Henry said, glancing nervously before stepping inside. "Good man, Bob Foster. He was asking the right questions, but nobody wanted to listen." "Your dad and I first met in 1999, Henry began, settling into the room's only chair. He started asking about unusual construction activity, vehicles at odd hours, deliveries that didn't make sense for residential areas. I'd been driving those roads for 30 years. I knew when something wasn't right. His eyes grew distant. Bob used to slip me sealed envelopes to mail from different post offices. Said it was safer. Never asked me to read them, but I could tell he was building a case against powerful people. I saw them installing pipes through your cabin property while you were away," Henry continued, voice dropping to a whisper. "No blueprints, no warning signs, working only at night with covered headlights. They claimed it was temporary technical drainage, but I watched those pipes run straight to the river like fancy septic lines." His voice carried bitter knowledge. "Your dad tried to expose them, and look what happened. They buried his career along with whatever evidence he'd found." We drove back at 3 a.m. in Henry's old pickup, headlights off until close to the property. The forest was alive with night sounds, owls calling, animals rustling, the distant sound of Cascade River. Henry knew a hiking trail around the back, a deer path through old-growth timber emerging near the cabin's rear boundary. We used red-filtered flashlights, moving carefully like soldiers on reconnaissance. Every snapped twig sounded like gunshot, and I held my breath whenever we paused to listen for pursuit. What we found confirmed my worst suspicions. An extensive network of black plastic pipes, buried shallow enough to access, but deep enough to hide. The system was complex, with junction boxes every few hundred yards and pressure relief valves disguised as landscape features. Henry sketched the layout while I measured with collapsible tape. The pipes were 12-inch diameter industrial grade, designed for significant volume and pressure, running from multiple Pine Ridge connection points to Cascade River, completely bypassing official treatment facilities. I collected water samples from the discharge point, immediately noticing sharp chemical smell that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. This wasn't residential wastewater, it was something dangerous. The liquid had oily sheen under our flashlights, with dead fish floating where the pipe emptied into the river. Henry watched grimly. "Your father suspected industrial waste dumping, but never got the chance to prove it. They destroyed his office the night before his big presentation, seized all files in a routine administrative review that lasted until his termination." As we prepared to leave, Henry grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Listen, son. Your dad didn't die naturally," he whispered urgently. "That cancer came too fast, too aggressive. He'd been healthy until he started poking around Pine Ridge. Then within 6 months, he was gone." The words chilled me, but hardened my resolve. "Mr. Torres, I'm not my father. I work for federal EPA now, with resources he never had. If they think they can bury the truth with their pipes, they picked the wrong family to mess with." Henry smiled for the first time that night. The drive back to Pine Creek felt longer than usual. Henry's words echoing in my mind like a warning bell. "Your dad didn't die naturally." The phrase kept repeating as I stared at the water samples sitting on my motel nightstand, their chemical smell a constant reminder of the toxins that had been flowing into Cascade River for over 2 decades. I needed more than suspicions and late-night discoveries. I needed Dad's original evidence, the documentation that had gotten him blacklisted in the first place. That's when I remembered Tom Hutchinson. Dad had mentioned him countless times over the years, his former colleague at the regional EPA office, the only person who'd stood by him during the Pine Ridge investigation debacle. If anyone had kept copies of Dad's original research, it would be Tom. I found his number in Dad's old address book, the pages yellowed and fragile like everything else from that time. The phone rang 4 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Tom, this is Graham Foster, Bob Foster's son." There was a long pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Jesus, kid, I was wondering when you'd call. Your dad always said you'd come looking for answers someday." Tom's voice carried 20 years of regret and careful silence. I kept everything, Graham. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence they tried to destroy. Been waiting in my garage for someone who'd know what to do with it. 2 hours later, I was standing in Tom's garage in Bend, surrounded by bankers' boxes labeled with dates from 2001. The smell of motor oil and old paper filled the air as Tom pulled out a dusty cassette recorder that looked like a relic from the 80s. Your dad was old school, Tom said with a sad smile. He always recorded his field notes on tape, said it was harder to alter than digital files. This one's from September 21st, 2001, 3 days before they raided his office. The tape crackled to life with Dad's familiar voice, younger and more energetic than I remembered from his final years. Field report, Pine Ridge investigation, day 47. Pattern analysis confirms industrial-grade discharge system running beneath residential development. Junction points appear to service multiple external sources. Need to identify primary contractors. Note: BH keeps appearing in construction permits, same initials on Nevada waste disposal contracts flagged by federal task force. My heart stopped. BH. Brent Harlan. Dad had identified him 22 years ago, long before I'd ever heard the name. But then another voice came through the static, softer and more careful. Bob, you need to be careful with this. If they're willing to threaten us, they're willing to do worse. Think about Graham. The voice was unmistakably my mother's, younger, but with the same protective tone I remembered from childhood. Tom saw my expression change and nodded grimly. Your mom knew, son. She helped him document everything until it got too dangerous. That recording is from the last time they worked together on the case. She made him promise to stop after they started getting phone calls at home. The tape continued with Dad's voice, more strained now. Linda's right. They're watching the house, following Graham to school. If something happens to me, Tom, you make sure my boy gets this evidence when he's old enough to use it safely. The final words on the tape sent chills down my spine. They think they can bury the truth by burying the messenger. But poison has a way of surfacing eventually. The river doesn't forget, neither will my son. The recording ended with the sound of paper shuffling and a door closing softly. Tom ejected the cassette and handed it to me with shaking hands. Your dad knew they were going to destroy him, Graham, but he also knew someday you'd finish what he started. I sat in Tom's garage holding the cassette, finally understanding the weight my parents had carried all those years. Mom hadn't just been a victim of Pine Ridge's manipulation. She'd been Dad's partner in the original investigation until protecting their family became more important than exposing the truth. The guilt I'd carried about her signing those papers began to shift into something else. Respect for a woman who'd sacrificed her husband's vindication to keep her son safe. There's one more thing, Tom said, pulling out a manila envelope sealed with duct tape. Your dad gave me this the day before they came for him. Said if anything happened, I should give it to you when you were old enough to understand. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the Pine Ridge pipe network, incredibly detailed and marked with dates, flow rates, and chemical signatures. At the bottom, in Dad's careful handwriting, for Graham, the truth is buried, but not dead. Follow the water. Trust no one. Accept the evidence. Love, Dad. I drove back to Pine Creek with 22 years of evidence in my passenger seat, finally understanding that this wasn't just about finishing Dad's investigation. It was about honoring both my parents' sacrifice. Mom had given up her husband's immediate vindication to protect their child. Now that child was grown, armed with federal authority and his father's meticulous documentation. The recording had revealed something else, too. If BH was already on Dad's radar in 2001, then Brent Harlan's appearance at Pine Ridge wasn't coincidence. It was a return to the scene of an old crime, probably to clean up loose ends that my arrival had threatened to expose. What would you do if you discovered your parents had been protecting you from the truth your entire life, because I was about to use that truth as a weapon? The next morning at Mabel's Diner, the only restaurant that looked unchanged since the 80s, a man in his late 30s approached my table. The diner was pure Americana, with red vinyl booths and chrome fixtures. Conversations died as I'd walked in, marking me as an outsider. The waitress had eyed me suspiciously, and I felt curious stares from scattered customers. The atmosphere was thick with small-town wariness. He wore a professional vest embroidered Energy Solutions Consultant and carried himself with practiced confidence. Everything screamed expensive. Perfect haircut, Italian leather shoes, a watch worth more than most cars. There was something off about the man's too smooth demeanor, a face I felt I'd seen somewhere I never wanted to be. "You must be Graham Foster," he said, extending manicured hand. "I'm Brent Harlan, environmental energy consultant for Pine Ridge Community. I understand you're having access issues with your family property?" His smile was practiced, fake in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Brent slid into the booth without invitation, ordering coffee with casual familiarity that struck me as odd for an outside consultant. His voice carried adaptable accent, not quite Southern, not quite Western, suggesting someone who'd lived many places. "I'm overseeing state-of-the-art solar energy systems and biological wastewater treatment for the community," he explained with false sincerity. Every word sounded rehearsed. "Perhaps I could help resolve your concerns? We maintain positive community relations." Something about his face nagged me. I'd seen it before. Not in good context. The bone structure was distinctive, sharp cheekbones and pale blue eyes that calculated everything. While he talked about cutting-edge environmental solutions, I discreetly ran reverse image search. His hands moved constantly as he spoke, practiced gestures of someone used to selling ideas to skeptical audiences. But there was nervous energy suggesting he wasn't as confident as he appeared. The search results made my blood run cold. Brent Harlan had been featured in a Las Vegas investigative report from 2018, identified as key figure in chemical waste disposal scandal that poisoned groundwater in 3 Nevada communities. The article described him as cleanup specialist who made environmental problems disappear through creative reporting and regulatory manipulation. He'd avoided criminal charges, but dozens of families were forced to relocate due to contaminated water, and several children developed rare cancers. I decided to play along, pretending interest while my mind raced through implications. If Brent Harlan was involved, this was far more serious than HOA disputes. "That's generous, Mr. Harlan. Could you show me these systems you're proud of?" His eyes lit with genuine enthusiasm. Apparently, he enjoyed showing off work or controlling narratives. We left together, and I noticed how he nodded familiarly to locals, as if he'd been part of the community for months rather than weeks. We walked around Pine Ridge, where he pointed out solar collection points and biological treatment nodes that looked suspiciously like camouflaged access points to the underground network I'd discovered. The tour felt choreographed, with Brent leading along predetermined paths, avoiding certain areas while highlighting others. Every few minutes, he'd check his phone or glance around as if ensuring we weren't observed. "This system is particularly special," he bragged, gesturing toward fake solar panels that couldn't power a flashlight, "completely independent from standard municipal systems." I kept my phone recording as Brent continued, unconsciously revealing more about the illegal operation than intended. His confidence grew as we walked, falling into the trap that probably brought down other environmental criminals. Irresistible urge to brag about technical achievements. "The beauty is complete independence from outside oversight," he said, gesturing at camouflaged infrastructure. "Everything handled internally, no external monitoring or reporting needed. We've created completely self-contained environmental solutions." When I pressed about permits and compliance, his demeanor shifted, revealing calculated predator beneath professional facade. "Some systems are too advanced for current regulatory frameworks," he said carefully, pale eyes hardening as he measured my reaction. "We work within alternative compliance structures. Corporate speak for completely illegal, and we both knew it." As we concluded, his phone rang urgently. I heard enough to understand he was reporting about the Foster situation, and Phase 2 needed implementing ahead of schedule. When he returned, his friendly mask had slipped, revealing something cold and dangerous. "Mr. Foster, I hope you understand the importance of maintaining community stability," he said, voice carrying unmistakable threat. "Some things are better left undisturbed. Your father learned that lesson the hard way." The implied threat hung like poison gas, and I realized I was facing someone probably involved in destroying Dad's career and possibly his life. I smiled back just as coldly. "Mr. Harlan, Karen told me I don't have the right to use that road. I'm going to use federal law to show her the road belongs to me, and the law belongs to my father's memory." I spent the day researching federal environmental protection statutes, looking for legal mechanisms to turn tables on Pine Ridge Community. My EPA background gave me access to regulatory databases most people never knew existed. After hours digging through environmental codes, I found exactly what I needed: temporary geological survey protection zones around suspected contamination sites. This regulation allowed federal officers to restrict access to potentially hazardous areas during preliminary investigations, with immediate implementation when environmental crimes were suspected. The paperwork was extensive but straightforward for someone with my credentials. I filed emergency application with EPA headquarters, classifying Pine Ridge as suspected unauthorized hazardous waste discharge zone, requiring immediate federal oversight. Within 36 hours, I had official authorization to establish temporary restriction zones around any area I deemed necessary for environmental protection. The authorization came with full federal backing. Local authorities couldn't override without lengthy appeals that could take years. I hired local construction crew to install proper federal restriction barriers across the main road leading into Pine Ridge, the same road they'd used to block my cabin access. The barriers were government-issued steel posts with reinforced concrete foundations designed to stop everything short of bulldozers. The signs were impressive. Environmental Investigation Zone, Federal Access Restriction, Authorized Personnel Only, in bright yellow letters visible from quarter-mile away. Unlike Pine Ridge's amateur gate, these were backed by United States Environmental Protection Agency, with interference being federal crime punishable by heavy fines and imprisonment. The reaction was immediate and panicked. Within hours, my EPA phone buzzed with angry calls from residents suddenly unable to reach their homes. They were trapped inside their development, unable to leave for work, shopping, or medical appointments without federal permission. One frantic mother begged for access to take her child to doctor's appointment, and I found myself genuinely sympathetic. "Ma'am, I can authorize emergency medical access, but you'll need documentation and accept federal escort." The human cost weighed on me, but I reminded myself these people had been living above toxic waste dump for years, unknowingly. The irony was delicious. They'd controlled access to my family property. Now I controlled access to their entire community. Every resident wanting to leave had to justify need to, federal investigator, submit to questioning about knowledge of illegal dumping, and accept possibility their home might be condemned. The psychological pressure was immense. People began calling EPA headquarters to complain, only resulting in more federal attention focused on Pine Ridge and its suspicious infrastructure. Karen Whitfield arrived around noon, her usual composure cracking under pressure from dozens of angry resident calls. She came in her white Mercedes with two expensive suited lawyers, setting up command posts outside federal restriction zone. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, makeup smudged, and for the first time she looked genuinely rattled. "You can't do this!" she screamed, voice shrill with panic. "This is illegal. I'll sue you, arrest you, contact every politician from here to Washington." The cool HOA president had been replaced by a desperate woman facing collapse of everything she'd worked to protect. I let her rant before calmly showing federal authorization paperwork which she snatched and studied desperately for loopholes. Her lawyers huddled around documents, whispering urgently, clearly recognizing legitimate federal authority backed by environmental protection statutes. "Ms. Whitfield, you have every right to file EPA complaint," I said with slight smile, watching her face pale as she realized the trap. "But they'll ask about that unauthorized underground pipe system, dumping industrial chemicals into Cascade River for 20 years. Are you prepared to explain that in federal hearing?" The beauty of my legal maneuver was perfect symmetry. They'd blocked my access to force me away from something they wanted hidden. Now I'd blocked their access to force them to reveal what they'd been hiding. Every day, barriers stayed up, pressure mounted from angry residents, media attention grew, and eventually someone would crack and reveal Pine Ridge's dark secret. Karen tried various threats and bribes over the next hours, but I kept smiling and referring her to EPA headquarters. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt like I was fighting back instead of just grieving. 3 days after locking down Pine Ridge, someone slipped a USB drive under my motel door while I slept. There was no note, just a single audio file labeled HOA_emergency_meeting_3 WAV. I plugged it into my laptop with trembling hands, knowing whatever was on this recording would change everything. The sound quality was poor, obviously recorded secretly, but I could clearly make out Karen Whitfield's voice addressing a small group in what sounded like someone's living room. "Linda Foster already signed the papers," Karen's voice came through clearly, each word hitting me like physical blow. "The cabin belongs to HOA territory according to adjusted property maps. He can't fight us without dragging his mother's reputation through mud." I nearly dropped the laptop. My mother, Linda Foster, had died 5 years ago in car accident, and I'd never heard about her signing papers related to the cabin. The recording continued with Karen outlining strategy. "We keep him distracted until federal investigation goes away. The boy doesn't know what his mother agreed to, and by the time he figures it out, we'll have full legal control." I immediately called our family lawyer, Martin Webb, who'd handled my parents' estate for decades. Martin, did my mother ever sign agreement with Pine Ridge Community about cabin property? Long pause before he answered, Graham, your mother called me panicked about 3 weeks before she died. She said someone was threatening to sue her for environmental damages if she didn't sign an easement agreement. I advised her not to sign without review, but she said she was too scared of legal costs to fight it. The documents Martin found painted a horrifying picture of emotional manipulation and legal fraud. Mom had been battling cancer treatment, her mind clouded by chemotherapy and judgment impaired by pain medication. They'd approached her during most vulnerable moments, claiming Dad's investigation had created liability issues. They'd threatened massive lawsuits, bankruptcy, and cabin seizure unless she signed temporary use agreement that effectively transferred road access rights to Pine Ridge HOA. The signatures looked genuine, but notarization was suspicious and several key pages were missing. Classic elder abuse case, Martin said grimly. Your mother was in no condition to understand what she was signing, and they knew it. I stared at the documents, hands shaking with mixture of grief and fury. Was it cowardice or protection? Did she think signing would save me? I didn't know if I should be angry or ashamed. They hadn't just stolen cabin access, they'd psychologically tortured my dying mother to do it, exploiting her love for family and fear of financial ruin. That evening, Brent Harlan showed up at my motel room, no longer bothering with friendly facade. His expensive suit was wrinkled, perfect hair disheveled, dark circles under pale eyes suggesting he hadn't been sleeping well since federal barriers went up. You need to stop this investigation and remove those barriers, he said bluntly. There are things you don't understand, forces bigger than your family's little property dispute. I looked at him standing in my doorway, this smooth-talking criminal who specialized in making environmental disasters disappear. Things I don't understand, I said, voice cold with barely controlled rage. Like how you people manipulated cancer patient into signing away her rights? Like how you've been poisoning the river for 20 years while hiding behind fake solar panels? His confident expression flickered, and I knew I'd hit target. Mr. Harlan, my mother trusted people like you, and it killed her. My father spent his life fighting people like you, and it killed him too. But I'm not my parents, and I'm not going to be your next victim. 3 days after the federal barriers went up, I was checking water sensor readings near the restriction zone when I heard footsteps approaching through the forest. It was past midnight and nobody should have been out here except federal personnel. I reached for my flashlight, then froze as a small figure emerged from the tree line. A teenage girl, maybe 16, with tangled brown hair and dirt-stained clothes. She looked terrified but determined, like someone who'd spent hours working up the courage for this moment. Are you Graham Foster? She whispered, glancing nervously back toward Pine Ridge. I need to talk to you. My name is Sarah Chen, and my dad is one of the engineers who built the pipe system. The words hit me like cold water. This wasn't just some random resident. This was the daughter of someone directly involved in the conspiracy. She pulled a folded paper from her jacket pocket with shaking hands. I heard my parents fighting about you last night. Dad said he didn't want a repeat of the Nevada situation, and Mom was crying, saying they should have never gotten involved with that man. Sarah's story came out in rushed, frightened whispers. Her father, David Chen, was a civil engineer who'd been hired by Brent Harlan 5 years ago to modernize the Pine Ridge waste management system. He'd been told it was a cutting-edge environmental project, using advanced filtration technology to process residential waste more efficiently than traditional treatment plants. It wasn't until construction was nearly complete that he realized the system was designed to bypass all filtration and discharge industrial chemicals directly into the river. Dad tried to quit when he figured out what they were really doing, Sarah said, her voice breaking. But that Harlan guy showed him photos of our house, of me walking to school, of Mom at the grocery store. He said accidents happen to people who don't keep their mouths shut about proprietary technology. She unfolded the paper she'd been carrying, a detailed schematic of the underground pipe network. Far more comprehensive than anything Henry and I had discovered. Dad keeps this hidden in his workshop. He says it's his insurance policy in case they try to throw him under the bus. The schematic confirmed my worst fears and then some. The Pine Ridge system wasn't just serving the residential community, it was processing waste from industrial facilities as far away as Portland, all of it flowing through the hidden network and dumping directly into Cascade River. The engineering was sophisticated and completely illegal, designed to handle millions of gallons of toxic waste while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate residential development. David Chen's signature was on every page, along with approval stamps from Brent Harlan and several other names I didn't recognize. There are other families like us, Sarah continued, wiping tears from her eyes. People who got in too deep before they understood what was happening. Dad says Harlan has leverage on at least 6 other residents, contractors, inspectors, even the local sheriff who approved the construction permits. We're all trapped here, knowing we're part of something terrible, but too scared to speak up. She looked back toward the darkened Pine Ridge development. When you put up those barriers, Dad said it was over. He's been drinking every night, saying they're going to blame everything on the engineers and let the real criminals walk away. I felt a surge of sympathy for this scared teenager caught in the middle of an environmental crime she'd had no part in creating. Sarah, I can help your family. The EPA has witness protection programs for people who cooperate with environmental crime investigations. Your father's testimony could be crucial for prosecuting the real criminals. She shook her head sadly. Dad's too scared. He says Harlan has connections everywhere, even in the federal government. The only reason I'm here is because I overheard him talking about destroying the schematics before the FBI gets here. As Sarah prepared to sneak back into Pine Ridge, she turned to me with a question that would haunt me for days. Mr. Foster, if my dad gets arrested, he deserves it for what he helped build. But please, can you make sure my mom and I get to leave here safely? We never wanted any part of this. I promised her I would do everything in my power to protect innocent families caught up in the conspiracy, knowing that environmental crimes always had collateral damage beyond the poisoned water and contaminated soil. Watching her disappear back into the forest, I realized the scope of Brent Harlan's operation was even more extensive than I'd imagined. He hadn't just built an illegal waste disposal system. He created a network of coerced accomplices and terrified families, all held in place by fear and blackmail. The barriers I'd erected weren't just containing environmental criminals. They were also trapping victims who'd been forced to participate in crimes against their will. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my motel room door with no return address. Inside was a USB drive labeled "For the EPA Investigator" in careful teenage handwriting. Sarah had managed to copy additional files from her father's computer, including financial records showing payments from chemical companies and email communications between Brent Harlan and his network of coerced engineers. The evidence was damning and comprehensive, but it also revealed the human cost of environmental crime, not just the communities downstream who'd been poisoned, but the families upstream who'd been terrorized into silence. What do you do when the victims and perpetrators live in the same houses? Because I was about to find out that sometimes justice requires protecting the people who helped commit the crimes. I spent the next 48 hours installing professional-grade water monitoring equipment at multiple points along Cascade River, upstream and downstream from Pine Ridge Discharge Point. The work was physically demanding, requiring me to wade into fast-moving mountain river in full protective gear while positioning sensors at precise depths. These were EPA-certified continuous monitoring sensors, worth thousands each, capable of detecting dozens of chemical compounds in real time and transmitting data to federal databases through encrypted satellite links. The results after 24 hours were worse than my darkest professional nightmares. I sat in my motel room at 3 a.m., watching real-time data stream across my laptop like evidence of environmental apocalypse. I stared at the numbers. 19 times over the limit. If Dad had seen this, he'd call it a slow-motion massacre. But that was just the beginning. Sensors detected dangerous levels of industrial solvents, heavy metals including lead and mercury, and several carcinogenic compounds that had no business near natural waterways, supplying drinking water to thousands downstream. Upstream readings were pristine, exactly what you'd expect from mountain river fed by natural springs and snowmelt. pH levels perfect, dissolved oxygen optimal for fish habitat, trace minerals within normal ranges. But downstream from Pine Ridge Discharge, water chemistry looked like chemical waste dump samples. I cross-referenced contamination signatures against EPA databases and found matches to chemicals used in electronics manufacturing, pharmaceutical production, and chemical processing. High-value waste companies paid premium prices to dispose of illegally. I immediately compiled emergency environmental crime report and sent it directly to EPA headquarters, bypassing local agencies that might be compromised. The report included real-time sensor data, photographic evidence, water sample analysis, and my professional assessment that immediate federal intervention was necessary. I marked it Priority 1 Environmental Crime and copied FBI Environmental Crime Task Force and U.S. Attorney's Office. The federal response was swift. Within 48 hours, EPA enforcement teams were mobilizing, and I was designated lead investigating officer for what was now classified as major environmental crime. The EPA teams arrived with enough equipment for full environmental crime scene investigation. They brought mobile laboratories, ground-penetrating radar, soil augers, and small army of environmental engineers, criminal investigators, and forensic specialists. I watched from Federal Command Post as they systematically mapped the entire underground pipe network, collected soil samples from dozens of locations, and documented every aspect of illegal dumping operation with surgical precision. The scope of environmental damage was staggering. 22 years of uncontrolled chemical discharge had contaminated not just the river, but entire groundwater system for miles downstream, creating toxic contamination plume that would take decades and millions to remediate. Soil samples revealed contamination depths up to 15 feet, and riverbed core samples showed chemical sediment layers like timeline of industrial crime. Investigation expanded to include 3 upstream chemical manufacturing facilities, paying Pine Ridge to dispose of waste illegally. When EPA issued preliminary findings, Pine Ridge community was immediately placed under federal environmental emergency status. All utilities were cut off, residents evacuated to FEMA temporary housing, an entire development declared hazardous waste site requiring extensive remediation. Financial damages were estimated in tens of millions, and criminal charges were being prepared against multiple individuals and corporations. Investigation had uncovered one of the largest illegal waste disposal operations in Pacific Northwest history. Karen and Brent's carefully constructed facade crumbled as federal investigators seized financial records, communication logs, and engineering documents revealing full extent of criminal enterprise. Bank records showed millions in payments from chemical companies, construction contracts for illegal pipe network, and elaborate money laundering schemes. Phone records revealed corruption network reaching into state government and federal agencies, suggesting corruption that would keep prosecutors busy for years. I stood in Dad's cabin for the first time in months, surrounded by EPA equipment and investigators documenting crimes he died trying to expose. 20 years ago, they thought destroying Dad's career would bury the truth, I told the lead investigator. Now the truth is digging up their entire operation. The irony was perfect. They'd spent decades hiding crimes beneath Pine Ridge. And now, federal investigators were literally digging up their secrets with excavators and soil analysis for criminal trials. The final phase required the most difficult decision I'd ever made, giving up the cabin that had meant so much to my family. I spent hours walking through rooms where Dad had lived his final years, touching furniture he'd built, standing in his office doorway where he'd worked nights trying to expose crimes that killed him. Every corner held memories, but after everything I'd learned, I knew the property could serve a higher purpose than preserving memories. I contacted EPA headquarters and offered to sell the cabin and surrounding property for $1, with stipulation that buildings could never be demolished and facility would bear Dad's name. EPA accepted immediately, recognizing strategic value of permanent monitoring station at the heart of Pine Ridge investigation and symbolic power of transforming victims' home into environmental justice center. Within 2 weeks, cabin was officially designated Robert Foster Environmental Monitoring Station. The transformation was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Dad's simple mountain retreat had become symbol of environmental justice and memorial to his sacrifice, but no longer the quiet sanctuary where our family found peace. Living room was filled with sophisticated monitoring equipment tracking water quality real-time. Kitchen converted to chemical analysis laboratory. Dad's bedroom served as conference room where prosecutors planned cases. Yet somehow, his presence still filled the space, as if his dedication had become part of the foundation. Criminal investigation moved swiftly once federal prosecutors took over. Karen Whitfield was arrested on charges of environmental terrorism, conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, racketeering, and organized criminal enterprise. Charges carrying potential sentences totaling over 30 years. Evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing millions from chemical companies, recorded conversations detailing cover-up and victim intimidation, testimony from dozens of witnesses, threatened into silence. Brent Harlan was extradited to Nevada for previous crimes but also faced Oregon charges for Pine Ridge conspiracy. His arrest made national headlines when investigators revealed his role in multiple environmental disasters across western United States, painting him as serial environmental criminal, helping corporations avoid cleanup costs by making toxic waste disappear into groundwater systems. Several Pine Ridge board members were indicted as co-conspirators, investigation expanding to include corporate executives from 3 chemical companies. The press conference was held at the cabin, with me standing on same porch where Dad used to plan his research while watching sunset over Cascades. Media from across Pacific Northwest gathered to hear EPA's official statement about Pine Ridge crimes and 22-year cover-up finally exposed. "I didn't come here just to scatter my father's ashes," I told assembled reporters. "I came to finish the investigation he started in 2001. They thought blocking my cabin access would hide their crimes, but they only led me straight to evidence I needed to expose them." The most satisfying moment came during my testimony at Karen's trial, when I presented complete timeline of events that destroyed my family and countless others. Courtroom was packed with victims, families forced from homes, children who developed rare cancers, elderly residents intimidated into signing fraudulent documents. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my father didn't die of natural causes," I said, looking directly at Karen in her orange jumpsuit. "He was slowly poisoned by same chemicals Pine Ridge community had been illegally dumping into our water supply for years. Karen once told me I didn't have the right to use that road," I said with slight smile, watching her stare at the defense table. "Now I want to tell her something. I've opened the road for everyone, including federal investigators who arrested her, but the prison door she'll walk through is staying closed for a very long time." Jury found her guilty on all counts after 3 hours deliberation, sentencing her to 25 years federal prison with civil penalties stripping every asset accumulated through criminal enterprise. I returned to the cabin one final time before transitioning back to regular EPA duties, driving up the same road that had been blocked by Karen's gate months earlier. The steel barrier was gone, replaced by simple wooden sign reading Robert Foster Environmental Monitoring Station, open to the public. The road had been upgraded by federal government, widened and paved for a steady stream of researchers, journalists, and environmental advocates making pilgrimages to see where one of the largest environmental crimes in Pacific Northwest history was exposed. Cascade River was running clear again, for first time in over 2 decades, no longer poisoned by chemicals that killed my father and terrorized local ecosystem. EPA scientists estimated several more years to complete full remediation, but most dangerous contaminants had been neutralized through intensive cleanup, costing convicted corporations over $100 million. Fish were returning to stretches barren for years, water quality readings showing steady improvement toward pre-contamination levels not seen since early 80s. Standing on cabin porch with Dad's urn, I finally felt ready to complete the task that brought me here and sparked a chain of events none could have predicted. I walked down to Riverbank, same path Dad had taken thousands of times during exile years, and carefully scattered his ashes into clean, flowing water. "Your work is finished, Dad," I whispered to the river. "Water is clean, criminals in prison, and your son is carrying on the fight." For first time since his death, I felt peace and closure that had everything to do with justice served and truth finally recognized. The Robert Foster Environmental Monitoring Station continues operating as model for federal environmental protection efforts, hosting training programs and serving as research center, attracting scientists and policymakers worldwide. The old cabin wasn't just preserved, it stood like a scar turned into a badge. Robert Foster Station wasn't a name, it was a promise carved into Oregon soil. I visit whenever work brings me back to Oregon, always amazed how Dad's simple mountain cabin became symbol of hope for environmental justice advocates across the country. The facility has expanded beyond original cabin, but Dad's office remains unchanged, preserved exactly as he left it, as memorial to his dedication. I returned to the cabin one final time before transitioning back to regular EPA duties, driving up the same road that had been blocked by Karen's gate months earlier. The steel barrier was gone, replaced by simple wooden sign reading Robert Foster Environmental Monitoring Station, open to the public. The road had been upgraded by federal government, widened and paved for steady stream of researchers, journalists, and environmental advocates making pilgrimages to see where one of the largest environmental crimes in Pacific Northwest history was exposed. Cascade River was running clear again for first time in over 2 decades, no longer poisoned by chemicals that killed my father and terrorized local ecosystems. EPA scientists estimated several more years to complete full remediation, but most dangerous contaminants had been neutralized through intensive cleanup, costing convicted corporations over $100 million. Fish were returning to stretches barren for years, water quality readings showing steady improvement toward pre-contamination levels not seen since early 80s. Standing on cabin porch with Dad's urn, I finally felt ready to complete the task that brought me here and sparked a chain of events none could have predicted. I walked down to Riverbank, same path Dad had taken thousands of times during exile years, and carefully scattered his ashes into clean, flowing water. "Your work is finished, Dad," I whispered to the river. "Water is clean, criminals in prison, and your son is carrying on the fight." For first time since his death, I felt peace and closure that had everything to do with justice served and truth finally recognized. The Robert Foster Environmental Monitoring Station continues operating as model for federal environmental protection efforts, hosting training programs and serving as research center, attracting scientists and policymakers worldwide. The old cabin wasn't just preserved. It stood like a scar turned into a badge. Robert Foster Station wasn't a name. It was a promise carved into Oregon's soil. I visit whenever work brings me back to Oregon, always amazed how Dad's simple mountain cabin became symbol of hope for environmental justice advocates across the country. The facility has expanded beyond original cabin, but Dad's office remains unchanged, preserved exactly as he left it as memorial to his dedication